All right, so this is going to be the outline for the talk I'm going to give today, or lecture I'm going to give it today. We're talking about colonial emancipation, when colonies were given independence, and under what circumstances. And then we're also going to talk about, well, I was hoping to talk about remaining nature, but I couldn't find any papers on it, so just ignore that part. And then we're going to talk about environmental movements, conferences. We're going to talk about more conferences, yay. Just like the London Convention of 1900, and then the big one that happened in 1933 that ended up pretty much laying down the foundation for conservation in Africa, mainly Africa for the most part. And then we are also going to talk about environmental movements. I must have wrote this outline when I was still planning the lecture. So yeah, we're mostly going to talk about colonial emancipation and environmental conferences. So ignore the environmental movements part, unless I forgot that I put that in the lecture. It'll be a surprise to me too. And we're going to start this off with a very brief video clip. Just another crash course history clip, because he kind of goes over the case of what's happening very well. Okay, so he says a hot button topic that he's not going to touch, and we're going to touch it. We've been touching it basically all this class. Yeah, colonialism basically screwed all, for the most part, mainly Africa, because the type of colonialism that occurred there was so intense. But yeah, it screwed all of what we call the developing countries or the global south. As he was mentioning, that the whole infrastructure was only built to get resources and take them out. That's roads, that's hospitals, maybe. They're not building schools out there. They're not providing education for people beyond what they need to get resources and take them out, right? They're not letting anyone actually govern, so they don't get experience in governing, and running a government is a very difficult thing. And yeah, so a lot of the problems nowadays, if we're going to focus on conservation, is capacity building. And this is kind of going off on a tangent, and I'm sorry, it looks like it's garbage collection time right now outside my apartment. But this is kind of going off on a tangent, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. So there's this thing called parachute science. And unfortunately, I was a parachute scientist, no matter how hard I tried not to be. And it's basically a scientist from a global north country like America, the UK, Germany, France, etc., going into these global south countries, doing research there, and then just leaving and not providing any infrastructure, not providing any training for local scientists. As I mentioned, I did my master's degree in at Virginia Tech, but I did my master's work in Madagascar. So I went out there for 2 field seasons, one in 2013 for 4 months and one in 2015 for 4 months. I was working with WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society. And in both cases, Madagascar has this setup where if you're coming in to do research, you have to be a mentor to a local Malagasy scientist. So for the most part, these Malagasy scientists are working through the University of Antananarivo, which is the university in the capital city of Madagascar. And so we're supposed to be mentoring them and helping them get their degree as well. And I'm trying to remember. I don't think I ever actually met my scientist that I was supposed to be working with. And I can't recall if I ever exchanged any emails with them as well. So that's a problem, right? And there were a couple of Malagasy scientists that I worked with later on in the later years. I went back for like a month 2 years ago, and I was working with some Malagasy scientists then. But even those relationships have sort of fallen short. And that's, in those cases, I hope it's kind of like half my problem, half their problem. I never really emailed them to check up on them and see what their degree was, how they were going in their degree, and whether they need help, any analysis and stuff like that. So, yeah, the whole point of that tangent was that if you have scientists coming in to the country and doing research and not teaching the locals how to do the science themselves, you're basically fostering dependence of this country on outside aid for their um, for their basic science information, for their conservation and management um, recommendations. Like WCS asked us to write up a thing where we basically broke down all of our research and told them what they should be doing with the park. And, you know, like you try to think about how that kind of stuff influences local people, but you can't really tell, right? Even if you were on the ground, you were never an actual local. You didn't grow up there. You didn't see what was happening really behind the scenes. So yeah, that's one issue with capacity building. In particular with conservation and science. So does anyone have any questions before I move on? Yeah. Well, let's see. Sorry, I was watching Hulu before this. Let's see if I can find something. There is a marine biologist. And I can't remember her name. It starts with the A, but she. Yeah, I don't know if she ever like actually gave. Her name is Asha DeVos, I think. And she gave a couple of TED Talks on whales, which is what she works on. But it doesn't look like. Well, she's the first person I ever heard parachute science as a term from. I follow her on Twitter. So I'll see if I can find anything. She probably wrote like an article on it maybe instead of talked about it. But yeah. So yeah, it's yeah, so as I mentioned at the beginning of this class, I never learned any of this kind of stuff in my classes, and I took a lot of classes while I was doing my undergrad and then master's and then PhD. So I never learned this stuff in a class. I always learned this stuff about colonialism and about eco injustice and decolonization and parachute science. from other sources outside class. So it's fine if you guys don't know about this stuff, because it's not like your teachers are teaching this to you. But there is a lot that you can learn outside of class in books, or even just following people on Twitter. So let me start this again. Okay, so decolonization, right? And this is what this period or this movement was called, the pulling out of colonial countries from their colonies in the global south. It was called decolonization. It was called, and decolonization as a basic term is undoing of colonization. And you can't undo what colonies did to colonizers did to their colonies, right? You can't put back the natural resources that they took out. You can't bring back the people that died because of what happened in those countries. You can't fix the power structures and the social ties and the cultural norms that disappeared because of colonization. So it's not decolonization. It's really just the colonizers deciding to leave their colonies for reasons that I'll mention on the next slide. But so just to start with South America. South America, actually, a lot of the countries in South America gained their independence in around the mid 1800s. Like Brazil was able to get their independence in 1822, and then they like turned into an empire, I believe. So they were able to get their independence pretty early. Southeast Asia and South Asia, there was a lot of mention about colonizers ruling through proxy rulers. So it was also somewhat more stable, and I'm not going to say easier, but that's the closest word I can get to it right now in my mind, for them to get their independence. So we have India and Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolence movement in the early 1900s. I think it was around 1920 or 30 or something like that. I don't have the exact dates, but they were able to get their independence as well. And most of Africa didn't get their independence until after World War II for reasons I'll mention in the next slide. United States did have and does have their own colonies as well. Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, Mariana, which is our islands kind of close to Guam, and the Virgin Islands, which are in the Caribbean. Those are all places that the United States colonized, and even now they're still part of the United States, but they're not. They're called territories. They don't get voting rights. They don't have senators or anything like that, but they're still under the jurisdiction of the United States, which is a whole other issue. Okay, so the reason that Africa gained their independence so late was because of World War II. Colonies were created to make money for the colonizer's country, right? The UK wasn't in South Africa just to be there, right? They wanted to make money off the natural resources that they could get from the country. So after World War II, most of these colonizing countries had a lot of debt from the war, and the debt and the changing times and the movements in these countries didn't make colonizing profitable anymore. So they were quick to move out for the most part. So in this case, countries gaining their independence was very rapid and unstable. As the video mentioned, a lot of the people that gained power in the interim and after independence for most of these countries were people that were either military, so were already part of the power structure that the colonizers had in the country, or people who were a little bit more educated than the norm. Sudan was one of the first Southern Africa countries to gain their independence in 1956. And then we have Djibouti in 1977 as one of the last. South Africa, the country, is a pretty interesting case because it was independent. It gained its independence from Britain in 1910 or something like that, pretty early. But it was ruled by the Afrikaners, the Dutch originated people that lived in South Africa. It was ruled by them for the most part until I want to say 1994. So I was 4 years old at that time. And I'm only 30 today. So it was very, very recent. But they ruled the country. They made sure that for the most part, the Black majority of the country could not vote. They had their own Jim Crow style system in place. It's called apartheid. And I could do a lecture on that, but it would take forever. I'm pretty sure there's just classes on it. All right, so any questions before we move into the conferences? Everyone good? Okay. So the first World Congress on National Parks was in 1962. And if you remember, like maybe half of Africa was decolonized and independent by that time. And we have J.F. Kennedy, the president, mentioning as rising population pressures tend to emphasize conversion of resources into commodities, we have to make sure that we actually preserve and safeguard these representative samples of the natural environment. So we already have mention of rising population pressures and conversion of resources into commodities. We already had mention of the whole overpopulation thing that I'm going to do a lecture on for module 4 because it's pretty fun to read about. But this first World Congress on National Parks was in Seattle in 1962. And this is just one half of the people that actually attended. And I think I counted like maybe 8 Black people, which would probably be African. They're not going to be Black people from America, unfortunately. So a lot of white men, some Japanese, some Asian people, but mostly a lot of white men. So reading from the PDF on the First World Congress, Congress actually came about thanks to Satoshi Tamura, who was this Japanese man known as the father of national parks in Japan. And he came up with the idea in 1958, and then they sort of ran with it. And in 1962, we have the Seattle Conference. And for the most part, the proceedings of this conference was really focused on protecting virgin land from development and thinking of national parks as places for people to escape from the pollution and the degradation of city life and sort of enjoy nature as as it is unspoiled and protected and all natural and clean. Um, they also thought of national parks as laboratories, so they wanted to keep places protected so that scientists can go into them and study ecology and the different species and sort of um, bolster the burgeoning foundations of the ecological sciences that we know today. There was a huge focus on this idea of African economies depending on tourism and depending on national parks for their GDP. Um, so there was a lot about Africa having last remaining unspoiled habitat present on the continent and how Africans should be so um, thrilled and thankful that they still have this habitat. And they did mention the 1933 convention from London, the one that preserved fauna and flora, um, because the colonizing countries wanted to preserve the animals that they hunted. And they thanked the people that were at that conference or that convention uh, for what was remaining in Africa. Um, and I really wonder how the African attendees felt about that, but they didn't mention it in their speeches and reports. So, and then there was also the idea of international organizations helping both manage the parks and preserve new land. So, do scientists need some sort of special permission to use national parks as a laboratory? Do you mean, okay, so back then they would need permits from the park authorities. I think that's what the convention of 1933 mentioned. It probably didn't mention it to you guys, but so we had those hunting licenses and strict nature reserves in the national parks. Strict nature reserves, no people could enter. National parks, it was a little less restrictive. Um, Class A and Class B animals. Class A, you could not hunt. Class B, you could hunt, but only if you had a license. So they had special permits for scientists that were coming in and naturalists that were coming in um, to collect specimens and stuff like that. But I'm pretty sure that it had been only focused on the national parks and not the strict nature reserves. Today, uh, today, scientists do need permits to enter national parks and to do research. So when I was doing my master's work in Madagascar, it was probably a little bit easier for me because WCS is the organization that's basically running the governance of the landscape up there in the Northeast. But I did have to write a proposal to the Madagascar government, basically telling them what kind of research I'm doing, whether I'm trying to catch any animals or not. If you were going to catch animals, you had a lot more information that you had to provide. But for me, I was just doing camera trapping like I usually do. So just taking pictures of animals. I didn't need all that. It wasn't all that stringent for me. I think the latest, like the most amount of time it took for me to send a proposal to the government and then to get a permit to do the research was probably 2 months. And that happened, I think it happened a year after one of the new presidents came in. So maybe he was changing things a little bit in the government. But it wasn't all that hard to get. How much of the original preserved land is still intact today? I couldn't find any information on that. I can see if I can find it again, or I'll look for it again. And I will, if I find anything, I will, I guess it will be. So I was looking for more, I was looking up search terms for historical and colonization and status of certain species. But if we're focused on protected areas, then I could probably find a paper or two on that. I'll see if I can get it for Thursday, and I'll talk about it before our discussion. Anyone else have any questions? Okay. All right. So as I mentioned in the last slide, we have this focus on Africa and the countries therein. Their economies should be focused on tourism and the national parks because they have all this land left, and the developed countries don't, and they would have tourists from outside of the countries coming in to see their wildlife and their natural resources. So this is one of the things I saw in the report from the proceedings of the First World Congress on National Parks. And already we have this idea of having to educate Africans on the value of these wild resources and natural resources, how he should value these resources. And I mean, you think about it, obviously, thinking about how the indigenous customs and the ways of relating to these animals probably broken by colonization, and generations of people, generations of Africans were kept out of these game reserves where they could have possibly gotten to know their animals and probably grown to have some sort of feeling for them, but they couldn't afford the permits, or the authorities were just racist and didn't want to give them a permit. So I put this in there particularly because this this idea of educating locals on how important the animals in their own backyard are. This is something that it's still around today. It's a huge thing, especially for parachute scientists. This idea of outreach and science communication, and saying, in my example, silky shafaka and all these lemurs, they're only found here in Madagascar, and you guys should really, I don't know, care for them as much as we care for them. And yeah, I guess it just rang a bell in me. So, but we're also talking about commercialized poaching as well, even back then in 1962. So that is also a trend that's sort of following us into the future. Okay. Yeah. So for me personally, and I can really only talk from a personal experience. So for me personally, what I had to do was I had to do a lot of soul searching and sort of step back and ask myself why I was so interested in going to these tropical countries. And I'm still interested in doing it. I still want to go back to Madagascar. I want to go to Southeast Asia next. Like I want to try and do camera trapping in places like Vietnam and Thailand and Borneo. Borneo is a huge place I would love to go to. But So I had to step back and ask myself why I wanted to go and focus on these animals that in these environments that were so out of my, I guess, my home territory, when there are tons of cool animals here in America. So when I was younger, as an undergrad, I never wanted to work on white-tailed deer, and I ended up working on white-tailed deer uh, for this PhD. And I basically chose this project because it was the only one that was going to pay me. So I wasn't really excited to join in on this project and work on white-tailed deer, but I grew excited because I was still able to ask the scientific questions that I was interested in, looking at things like interspecific interactions and how predators influence prey. And because I was working on this project, I grew really interested in coyotes because they're super smart and they're super adaptable, and they're across they're across North America, they're across the United States. So you can ask a ton of interesting questions about how their ecology and their behavior changes, um, particularly as they go from being like a mesopredator in the West, uh, where you still have pumas and grizzly bears and things like that, versus out here in the East where they're basically, other than the black bears, they're basically the apex predator. Um, I also got interested in native bees, which was just a random thing I got interested in because of photography. I started doing macro photography. So for me, I had to do a lot of soul searching. And like I said, I still want to go back and do field work out in those countries. But if I do go back, I'm making myself promise that I'll do some sort of workshop, and that'll be my main objective. So I'll be teaching local scientists things like occupancy analyses and how to run camera trap grids and stuff like that, just so that they don't have to keep on shopping outside of their borders to be able to do that kind of stuff. Um, so when it comes to the appreciation factor, I guess for in my part, what I've ended up doing is that it's fine to sort of tell locals that you're really interested in their animals and how cool their animals are, and we have none of those things like we do back home. But you leave it at that, right? You don't try and say, and that's why you guys have to really focus on conserving them, because Americans back home really want these things to remain on the earth, because it's their animals, right? You can give appreciation, but you can't tell them what to do with what they have, right? That's you just sort of have to, yeah, for me, it's been more of a step back and let them handle things as they're going to handle them. And um, it requires giving a lot of trust, I guess, to people that you might not feel like trusting because they don't know, how important these animals are. Maybe they don't know how many animals are left of this species, or, blah, blah, blah. I'm pretty sure you got to trust that they know. You got to trust that they care about them, but you got to trust that they know exactly. You got to trust their motives. You got to know, you got to trust that they'll be willing to conserve what they have within reason, I guess. Does that make sense? I feel like I've rambled on a lot. What did you study while working with the white-tailed deer? So that was my project, PhD project I just defended. And I was looking at fawn anti-predator behavior. So basically, if you have black bears and bobcats and coyotes, they all eat white-tailed deer fawns. How do white-tailed deer fawns use their space and use the time that they're given? So when are they active? Day, night, dusk, dawn, etc. And then are they more vigilant where there's more predators around, or are they not? Basically, how do fawns make it through their first summer? And I was lucky enough to be able to do all that with camera trap data. So using a lot of different analyses, but yeah. I know Tess Gingery was able to, she's a master student, or she was a master student. She was able to radio collar white-tailed deer fawns as part of the same project, but like a different thing. So she actually got to touch fawns. I didn't, but I got pictures of them. So, all right. Any other questions? Yeah, yeah. There's got to be a lot of trust on both sides, and sort of a lot of questioning of assumptions from both parties. What you assume about the other person and why you're assuming those things. So, anything else? If not, we'll move on to the conference in 1972. This is also called the Stockholm Conference. It was in Stockholm, Sweden. Not connected to the World Parks or World National Parks Congress, but it's a totally different thing. And so I think there was like 113 countries, 72 of those or 73 were developing countries. And that's sort of when you start seeing this term of developing versus developed and development versus conservation. So looking at the proceedings of this conference, so we have the screenshot. Obviously, you have developing countries and the attendees from those developing countries putting forth the idea that 2/3 of the world's population is dominated by poverty and malnutrition and illiteracy and misery, and that mankind should be focused on facing those problems first instead of focusing necessarily on the environment or putting the environment ahead of people. You also have this mention of the gap between the poor and the rich countries, the developing and the developed, and how it needs to be narrowed if there's going to be any progress on protecting the environment. Oh, I have another. Yeah, so I was able, so there was this, I don't know if she was, she was more than an attendee. I think she was really important. Maybe she was a president. She was a leader in India, and I wish I remembered what her position was, but her name is Indira Gandhi or something like that. But she gave this really good speech, and I was trying to find the speech for this, and I could not, unfortunately. But while I was looking for the speech, I was able to find this little news clip, which I'll share.
Have to pay the debt, and people are scrambling to see that the other fellow pays. So we're beginning to divide up, and I think we begin to see industry, labor, and consumers beginning to take very sharp sides on these issues. It's become, I think, a very basic and quite dangerous political issue, because it leads very quickly to fundamental concerns that we've tended to push under the rug. The question of the validity of the private enterprise system, for example. The question of whether we can tolerate wars. Questions of racial discrimination. These are things that we tend to avoid talking about, but the environmental issue sort of casts a bright light on them. making them very difficult to avoid.
And let me point out to you that the old corny economist argument that we are doing an enormous favor to various third world countries by buying their minerals from them is just plain ordinary hogwash. We in the rich nations eventually will have the energy, we think, and the technology to provide substitutes when the high-grade minerals are gone, leaving the third world holding the bag if we continue to go on down that route. It's quite clear to me, I think it's quite clear to most ecologists who have looked at the situation, that you cannot separate the question of the rich and the poor from the question of preserving the world's environment.
I think the developing countries begin to realize that they have been victimized ecologically, so to speak, by colonization. That the population explosion is in effect the last remnants of the harmful influence of colonization on the colonies. And the proposition, which I believe will come up at the official conference here for ecological reparations, I think is a just idea, which the developing countries are putting forward, and which I think reflects very clearly their proper understanding of the ecological base of their difficulties.
It must be realized that the integration of environmental control programs in the economic development program of developing countries will call for additional resources which are already limited in these countries. We believe that if developed countries are genuinely interested in the improvement of the overall human environment, for after all, we all live in one world, this extra burden should be partly shared by the developed countries.
The developed countries must understand that countries engaged in an all-out struggle to improve the well-being of their people and which are deeply concerned with problems of development tend to see strict environmental controls as a luxury which they cannot afford.
The major problems of the physical environment in Ghana are not those caused by industrial pollution or the spoliation of pleasure beaches by oil from huge tankers, but the simple, elementary ones of biological pollution, such as the disposal of human excreta and the removal of disease-bearing organic matter from drinking water. In fact, in most areas of Africa, the provision of safe potable water is the most important physical problem of the environment.
Countries with but a small fraction of the world's population consume the bulk of the world's production of minerals, fossil fuels, and so on. Thus we see that when it comes to the depletion of natural resources and environmental pollution, the increase of one inhabitant in an affluent country at his level of living is equivalent to an increase of many Asians, Africans, or Latin Americans at their current material levels of living. The inherent conflict is not between conservation and development, but between environment and the reckless exploitation of man and earth in the name of efficiency.
If poor nations are faced with the problem of growth within acceptable environmental limits, the rich nations are clearly caught up with it even more seriously. We're meeting in this worldwide conference largely because the evidence is now overwhelming that roughly a century of very rapid economic advance throughout the world has contributed to a monstrous assault on the quality of life in the developed countries.
We have got to learn to live with stabilized populations, with a more modest use of resources, and we cannot cheat by simply saying we're going to carry on with the same division as we have now, because if 2/3 of humanity, as our delegates have been telling us again and again today, if 2/3 are to stay poor so that 1/3 can stay rich, my friends, they won't do it. It's as simple as that.
It has been my experience that people who are at cross purposes with nature are cynical about mankind and ill at ease with themselves. Modern man must re-establish an unbroken link with nature and with life. He must again learn to invoke the energy of growing things and to recognize, as did the ancients in India centuries ago, that one can take from the earth and the atmosphere only so much as one puts back into them. In their hymn to earth, the sages of the Atharva Ved chanted, What of thee I dig out, let that quickly grow over. Let me not hit thy vitals or thy heart. So can man himself be vital and of good heart and conscious of his responsibility. I thank you, Mr. President.
We talk about quality of life. Well, quality of life is based upon what people think is most important when they're called upon to decide. Now, we've gone out of the period when we can just simply think that anything is possible. Man has sobered up somewhat, and the environment issue has made him realize that he does.
Yeah. So again, throughout those speeches, we have this idea of basically development versus conservation. And we also have mention of the population explosion. And we also have this idea, which I really hope you guys, it's 10 o'clock, which I hope you guys really focus on, this idea of lifestyles, right? So Ms. Gandhi, the Prime Minister, mentioned the idea of one person in an affluent nation having the lifestyle, living the lifestyle of an affluent nation, having the same effect on the earth as many in an African or an Indian or Southeast Asian or a Latin American country, which we are going to talk about more during the overpopulation lecture, because it's really important to sort of separate numbers from lifestyle. Okay, any questions first? This lecture isn't that long, so I should be able to finish it before the end of the class. Everyone good? Okay. Just stop me if you do have a question. All right. So in addition to the whole idea of development versus conservation, so this thing called the Environment Fund was proposed during this conference, and it was supported, but there were concerns, as the screenshot says, that the fund would be regarded as an alternative to development assistance from developed countries for developing countries, and this idea of the polluter must pay, which is still an argument that we've got going on today, unfortunately. China was being pretty messy during this. It was pretty funny. So China sort of really riled up a lot of the developing countries' attendees, mentioning that the main reason for the pollution of the environment, right? The declaration did not mention, as they felt the main reason for the pollution of the environment was this policy of plunder, aggression, and war carried out by imperialist, colonialist, and neo-colonialist countries, especially by the superpowers. And they could not agree with the declaration. I don't think that they actually, I'm not sure if they actually signed, I don't think China's attendees signed the declaration that came out of this conference or not. But they sort of said what a lot of the developing country attendees were thinking. And so they definitely got a lot of developing country attendees agreeing with this idea that the problem with the environment was the cause of the superpowers in the world. So we have the Stockholm Declaration coming out of this conference, and it has human rights listed first and the protection of natural resources listed second. But it seemed from my reading that very little else was done except for the establishment of this UN program called the Environmental Program, which is supposed to focus on how countries were doing in regards to sort of following along with the Stockholm Declaration and the developed countries providing assistance to the developing countries to sustainably develop. More conferences. So we had the first World Conference on National Parks, Seattle, 1962, and we have a lot more of them during the interim. So in 1972, there was a second one, and they were already seeing issues with tourism in the national parks, a lot of issues with people polluting, the tourists polluting, or harassing the animals, or driving in areas that they weren't supposed to be driving. In 1982, there's a further emphasis on conservation linking with sustainable developments. I think 1982 that was the first one that was actually in what you would call a developing or global South country. That was supposed to be in Bali, Indonesia, I believe. I think that's correct. 1992 was in Venezuela, if I remember correctly. And they start talking about, that's when we first start talking about indigenous views of protected areas. And this is a screenshot from the proceedings that came out of that conference. The IUCN recognizing indigenous territorial rights as a precondition for establishing and managing protected areas. Recognizing their traditional ecological knowledge, the local ecological knowledge that we talked about earlier this semester. Documenting and applying this knowledge to manage resources, and then also recognizing the importance of women's knowledge and participation, and recognizing the intellectual property rights of indigenous people, which is really important when you're thinking about things like what happened with the Ugandan bacteria and the development of that vaccine that could help with a ton of really important diseases like cancer and psoriasis and leprosy. But the people that pointed it out to the company and their research scientists aren't getting a penny. In 1992, we have another United Nations Conference on Environment. So this is the 20th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference. This is called the Earth Summit. It was in Rio, Brazil. NGOs were included as attendees. So it wasn't just countries, it was representatives from NGOs. And the website listed a list of achievements, which were mostly just papers, declarations that people supposedly signed. You have Agenda 21, the Rio Declaration, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we get climate change thrown in there first. The Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Declaration on the Principles of Forest Management. And then we also get the birth of this Commission on Sustainable Development, from which, from what I was able to see, I think they meet every 2 to 4 years and talk about how well the countries that ratify these different conventions and declarations are actually fitting or working within the parameters of the declarations or conventions that they ratified. So I'm only going to break down 2 of these, I believe. First, Agenda 21, it was non-binding. None of the countries signed it and none of the countries ratified it, but they all verbally agreed that they agreed with the principles within the declaration. One of them was this idea of liberalizing trade across the global economy and sort of making it easier for developing countries to export the products that they create into developed countries, improving the market access for these developing countries. And if you guys have been paying attention to the coronavirus issue and the vaccines, you guys hopefully have heard that last week, American and European officials, the attendees to this conference or this little gathering, they basically said that they wouldn't they wouldn't support improving access of the developing countries to this vaccine. So they wouldn't support improving access of these countries to the ingredients to the vaccines, the recipe of the vaccine, or the ability to build and create this vaccine for themselves. Yeah, so they basically sided with the companies that created the vaccine over these 20, 50 some countries. I didn't count, but it's most of Africa, most of sub-Saharan Africa. I think a lot of Southeast Asia, a lot of Latin America, etc. And I mentioned this issue is because first, the problem is that they don't have the ingredients to build it or create the vaccine on their own. And it's not only that, it's that they don't have the capacity to make the vaccines on their own, right? And so we get into that idea of capacity and a lack of infrastructure or a lack of knowledge that these countries have to be able to do this thing that these companies in the global north are able to do. The companies aren't willing to share how to manufacture the vaccines with these countries, not willing to share the recipe, and I don't know. Yeah, so like if you think about it, right, you can have all Americans vaccinated by August. And for most of these African countries, it's not likely that most of their population will be vaccinated until 2023, 2024. If you think about it from a government standpoint, you are going to try and avoid, or you're going to have cause to try and avoid people from these unvaccinated countries coming into your country. So you get into this issue of immigration and border control, which is already messed up. And if we're going into overpopulation, you also get this, I will bet you $200 that there are people out there that are glad that these countries aren't getting the vaccine, and they're hoping that the virus will kill more people before they get the vaccine because it will help with the overpopulation problem. And again, we will go into that later. I have a huge issue with overpopulation, as you guys have probably noticed. Okay, moving on to, so this is the big one, the chapter 4, changing consumption patterns. And this is where in Agenda 21, we really get into some meaty things, and the declaration mentioning that the problem and the cause of the deterioration of the environment is because the consumption and production, particularly of industrialized countries, the global north, and that developing countries need additional financial resources to be able to actually sustainably develop and take care of these global environmental problems caused by the global north. And for the last bit, we have the Convention on Biological Diversity. So again, we have this idea of the developed countries providing new and additional financial resources to enable developing country parties to actually sustainably develop and protect biological diversity at the same time. The United States did not ratify. So I don't know if you guys learned this or not, but I thought that the United States had signed this. I don't know why. They did sign it. They signed it a year later, which is basically them avoiding being legally bound to this declaration, but still giving this idea. They can say truthfully that they signed it, but they did not ratify it, and they're not legally bound to it. I just thought it was kind of a sneaky thing, and I hated it. Okay, so finally we have the Durban Accord, which came from the 5th World Parks Congress in 2003. That happened in South Africa. And this is just a screenshot of the proceedings sort of action plan, if you will. And so we see that they're still talking about protected areas being important to conserve global biodiversity, protected areas actually having a role in sustainable development and alleviating poverty. We get into this idea of a global system of protected areas being linked and improving the effectiveness of protected area management. And then over here on outcome 5, we have the rights of indigenous peoples being recognized in relation to natural resources and biodiversity conservation. So as a takeaway, so we have decolonization occurring right after World War II for the most part. Colonies in this situation are left with very little capacity to do anything, govern, industrialize, create things that other countries will want to buy, protect their natural resources, etc., leaving them in a very weak and vulnerable state for the global north to continue sort of running things behind the scenes, whether this is through NGOs or sanctions. We have a focus on these congresses on national parks changing throughout the years, going from this idea of national parks being laboratories and places where tourists can go and leave the dirty city life behind to places that are important for the conservation of global biodiversity. And again, we have this constant battle between conservation and poverty alleviation, and this idea of global north paying for the global south, protecting the remaining natural resources on earth. And another idea of teaching locals about their resources, as if colonization didn't break down all those cultural ways of relating to natural resources. And that's all I have. Does anyone have any questions?